It is such a compelling story. I really can't wait to get into this next series as we dive into this story that has been so meaningful for the years, for so many believers along the way. Well, it's great to see you today. It's great to have you worshiping with us. I'm happy to have you here. And, I look around, you all look especially rested this morning. So I want to just do a little quick survey. Who likes the time change? Anybody here likes the time change? Let's see the hands of those who like it. Both the fall and the spring one. Okay, who doesn't like the change? Okay, there's a strong component there. Okay, how about this? Who only likes this time change when you get an extra hour sleep? Who only likes that one? There's my people right there. Who would be okay with losing an hour in the springtime if it was moved to 4 p.m. on Friday? Anybody would be good with that? If they change it till then, why aren't we doing that? Who thinks getting an extra hour of sleep in the fall time change is a joke because you have young kids? Anybody? Or a dog? Right? I get you. All right, this one isn't on there, but I'm curious about this. It just struck me. Who thinks that this is second service right now? Anybody? You think you're a second service? All right. Well, today we launch a month-long series entitled Prodigal. For the next 4 weeks, we will dissect Jesus' iconic parable about the wayward son. And there are few narratives in the entire Bible, in the world really, that expose the rebel streak in the heart of each of us, like this story does. Christian author Tim Keller said that when he heard this parable explained really for the first time and amplified and understood what it was really about, it unlocked the heart of the Christian message for him. He writes, listening to that sermon changed the way I understood Christianity. I almost felt I had discovered the secret heart of Christianity. He went on to say, I have seen more people encouraged, enlightened, and helped by this passage than by any other text. And in this series, I believe Jesus will do the same. He will both challenge as well as deepen the very heart of our faith as we immerse ourselves in this parable. Because, bottom line, we can all be prodigals. Ever wonder why sometimes we find ourselves pulling away from God? Where does that wild, stubborn, rebellious streak come from? Ever wonder if God's patience with us runs out? Can God's grace really satisfy our restlessness? I've noticed a bit of a theme in the conversations that I've been having with people lately, and maybe it's just because I've been living with this parable, but it seems to be there in so many people's stories. Several people have recounted to me how, looking back over their lives, there were whole seasons in their story where they walked away from God. Why are we so prone to wander? What is it in the human makeup that goes rogue? I became a believer when I was 14 years old, just a young teenager. I got off to a good beginning, lots of promise. But then we moved during my high school years, a new school, new friends, new challenges. And God took a back seat in my life. Suddenly, school, friends, sports, all became everything to me. Where does that prodigal spirit come from? Where we're prone to walk away for whole seasons of our life from God. Well, before we go any further, it's going to be important for us to define prodigal. One definition is this, to be recklessly extravagant or having spent everything. But if you think about it, when we use the word prodigal, when we talk about prodigal, about ourselves or others, we usually mean someone who lives a wild life, reckless and raucous. For us, to be prodigal is synonymous with bad behavior. But as we will see in this parable, prodigal can also simply mean to be far from God, far from His heart, far from His intentions for you. You might not be in a distant place, but you could still have a distant heart. In other words, you can be a compliant prodigal. You can look really good on the outside, follow all the rules, show up for church every week, and still be far from God on the inside. So here's a bit of a spoiler alert that'll really set us up for this whole series. Along the way in this series, we will quickly realize that there is not one prodigal in this story, but two. Two different prodigal paths, two different kinds of wild, two different ways to be alienated from God. And in the end, we will see we are all prodigals. So let's get into it. Open with me to Luke chapter 15. Luke 15 in your Bible is a chapter that is famous for containing three different lost and found stories. Maybe you've heard today's parable before, maybe not. But chances are you've never thought very much about the setting in which it was spoken. What was going on when Jesus told this parable for the first time? Who was around him? Who was gathered there in that setting? Well, the first two verses of this chapter help us understand that. So look at this, Luke 15, starting in verse 1. It turns out there were two very different groups who were gathered to hear Jesus that day. Luke 15:1 says this, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus." That's one group. The tax collectors and sinners, often grouped together. Tax collectors and sinners. That's one group. Verse 2, "But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them,'" referring to the other group. They are then the second group, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Two very different groups in the audience that day, the sinners and the tax collectors, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Two polar opposite kinds of people listening to Jesus. The tax collectors and the sinners were the rebels of society. They were despised back then, considered unclean and unacceptable. They didn't observe the laws of the Old Testament. Instead, they challenged all the conventions of their culture. Then there were the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They were the good guys. They were the respectable and admirable members of society. They embraced all the traditions of their upbringing. They studied the Old Testament. They kept the law to the letter. And so, if Jesus is going to tell a story about a good son and a bad son, everyone in the crowd that day figured they already knew who's who. So now skip down to verse 11 where we get to the parable that will be the focus of our entire month. Luke 15:11. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons." Now notice this is a parable about 2 sons, not one. We have nicknamed it the parable of the prodigal son, singular. But we should really call it the parable of the prodigal sons, plural. Again, verse 11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons." Perhaps Jesus looked around the crowd at that moment. He saw 2 types of people gathered there. He sensed the natural animosity between the 2 groups. I mean, it is true they were of the same heritage, the same nationality, the same ethnicity. Both groups were descendants of Abraham. But beyond that, they could not be more different. And the sibling rivalry between the 2 was intense. First, Jesus talks about the younger son, one kind of prodigal. Verse 12. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." Now at that point, the crowd probably gasped. This was a shocking request. I mean, the inheritance usually came after the father died. And no one back then would have so boldly asked for their inheritance early. He didn't quite say, "I wish you were dead," but that was the implication. Tim Keller explains, the younger son was saying essentially that he wants the father's things, but not the father. This is one kind of prodigal. We want the life that God gave us, but we want it on our terms, our way, not His. We want to live life the way that we see fit in our timing and the ways that we think would make us happy. That is one kind of prodigal. Again, verse 12. The young one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. The father's response would have been equally shocking to the crowd that day. He actually agreed. I mean, no one would have had a problem if the father at that point had rebuked his son. No one would have blamed him if he shut him down. Instead, he amazingly agreed. Just like God the Father, He gave him his free will. He allowed him his choice. Now, the younger son's portion would have been about a third of his father's entire wealth. Back then, the older son would be allotted a double portion. So he was given immediately a third of his father's lifetime of wealth. Verse 13. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. Some things never change. Instant wealth hardly ever lasts. This suddenly rich young man began to throw his money around like there was no tomorrow, until there was nothing left for tomorrow. The word squandered, it means wasted. We could equally say he wasted his wealth on wild living. And that phrase, wild living, could be translated debauchery. Later in the parable, we learn that part of his money was depleted through prostitution. So this is one kind of prodigal, a slave to self. A slave to self. This kind of prodigal spirit allows your quest for enjoyment and satisfaction and fulfillment to so rule your life that it becomes your master. It rules you and it eventually destroys you. We see that in verse 14. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. Again, I want you to imagine the crowd gasping. Even though these are two very different groups gathered there in the crowd that day, they were all Jewish. And to go to work feeding pigs, these ceremonially unclean animals, was about as low as you could go. Until it got even lower. Verse 16, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. This guy who had recently been dining on surf and turf and caviar was now willing to eat slop. I'm struck by the first four words of verse 16. He longed to fill. He longed to fill his stomach. So much of this kind of prodigal is longing to be filled. It's simply a quest to find fulfillment, to find satisfaction, to fill our lives in the ways that we think would be best, that would entertain us, that would fulfill us, that would satisfy us. And that's because God made us that way. He made us to be fulfilled and satisfied and delighted. But we cannot find it far from God. We cannot find it far from the Father. Verse 17. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death?" He came to his senses, sort of. I mean, It's true, it was making logical sense. But this statement reveals just how much he had lost. He began the story, remember, he began wanting his full rights as a son. Give me my inheritance, my right as your son. Now he has resorted to simply hoping that he could be restored to a servant. If only I could be one of my father's servants. His aspirations had dropped so much. Verse 18, I will set out the younger son reasons. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. That would be his speech. That's what he would say. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Just simply make me one of your hired servants. Verse 20, so he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, kissed him. It's often commented that back then it was undignified for a father to run in public. And so for Jesus to emphasize this part of the story, he underscores just the eagerness of God, the Father, to welcome all of his prodigals home. Verse 21, the son said to him, here comes that well-rehearsed speech. He'd probably said it over and over again all the way home. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But that right then, there's more to that speech, right? What about the whole part about make me like one of your hired servants? The whole game plan about the terms under which he might be welcomed back. The younger son never gets to that part. Why? Because the father interrupts. Verse 22, but the father said to the servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. The best robe in the house would have been the father's robe. The ring would have been a ring with a family seal on it. It would indicate that he'd been fully restored and welcomed back as a full-fledged son. Not a servant, a son. The father continues, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. Fattened cow was something you'd have, really special celebrations. Imagine you send your first child off to college, and then a few weeks later, they come home for the first time to visit, and you take them to, that special restaurant. Or how about this? You serve turkey and stuffing and mashed potato and pumpkin pie. It's only late September. It would send a message your child is coming home. It's like a time for Thanksgiving. The fattened cow was an unmistakable message. This was a huge celebration. Why? Verse 24. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. I thought he was dead. I thought he was gone. And he's back. So let's celebrate. Now that could easily be the end of the story, happy ending. Matter of fact, if you read the first two stories that lead up to this one in the chapter, it should have been the end of the story. In the first two stories that Jesus tells, the first two parables, they end here. They end with the summary of the two stories end with something lost being found. And we would find this summary statement at the end of both of the other parables. They both ended this way. In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over a sinner who repents. In other words, the first two parables were all about rejoicing when something was found. Something lost came back. A sheep, a coin, now a wayward son. And Jesus' listeners would have been prepared for him to end the story right here. He just told two previously, and that was the happy ending. But Jesus surprises everyone by continuing the story. Now turning our attention to the older brother. Because as it turns out, there is another kind of prodigal, another way to be far from God. Verse 25. Meanwhile, the older son, oh yeah, remember there's two sons. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, "What's going on?" "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." So, certainly the older brother will drop everything and race over to see his younger brother. If the aged father ran, certainly the son is going to run as well. He has to be over the moon excited that his brother has returned, right? Right? Edmund Clowney tells the true story that come from the days of the Vietnam War. A young man who was a U.S. soldier was listed as missing in action. The family tried everything to find out what happened. They couldn't get any information through official sources. He was just missing. So the soldier's older brother flew to Vietnam and risked his own life searching the jungles and battlefields for his lost brother. And the only reason that he wasn't hurt, killed, or captured is because both sides had heard about his dedication, and both sides respected his pursuit. He became well known as simply the brother. So certainly that's how this brother would respond, right? He would drop everything and race to his younger brother. He must be so excited that his prodigal brother has returned, right? Not exactly. Verse 28. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. I don't know, maybe at this point the Pharisees and the crowd began to squirm as Jesus got to this part of the story. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. Make sure you catch this because this is important. The same father who ran to meet his wayward younger son now leaves the party and races out to plead with his older son. We are not told what the father said at first, only that he pleaded with him. He must have said something like, Come in, join the party. Your younger brother has returned. There's so much that we have to celebrate. Leave the field. Now is a time for great joy. But the older brother was not in the mood to celebrate. And his words are so revealing. Verse 29, but he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you." That's important. Although he was the oldest son, with the most privileges in that culture, he viewed his relationship with the father as a slave, not a son. "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you." He saw himself primarily as a worker. It was all about obligation. Another kind of prodigal becomes a slave to duty. If you think about it, in both ways, in a way, both the younger son and the older son were exactly the same. Both had reduced sonship to servanthood. Both had seen themselves primarily as slaves rather than sons. Again, verse 29. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours," notice, not my brother, "this son of yours, he's yours, not mine. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, You kill the fattened calf for him. The son accuses his father of being more excited about celebrating the bad son than honoring the good one. But then look at the heart of the father that mirrors the very heart of God in verse 31. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours, which was literally true since he had already given the portion that the younger son got to him. All that I have is yours. You are always with me. But then the father adds in verse 32, but we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And by putting it that way, it revealed just how out of sync this son was with the father's heart. Even though he had never left home, he was miles away from the father. So what's the older brother going to do? The listeners are on the edge of their seats. Did the father convince him? Did he join the celebration? Did he forgive his younger brother and make things right? We don't know. Jesus doesn't tell us. He leaves us hanging. Why? Because the real point of this story is not about the older brother, but about what the Pharisees in the crowd, who were so much like the older brother, what they would do. Would they look around and rejoice that these tax collectors and sinners were returning to the Father? Would they join the celebration? Or would they keep their distance and remain just another kind of prodigal? Which begs the question, whose side is Jesus on? And this is where the parable reflects the radical truth of Christianity. He's on both sides. He longs for the wild living, reckless, raucous, tradition-challenging prodigals to be liberated from their self-imposed slavery and discover their place as God's children. But he also longs for the clean-living, tradition-keeping, duty-driven prodigals to be liberated from their slavery and also come to the party. Also discover their place as God's children. He's on both sides. More than that, God the Father has one solution for both of them. Exchange slaving for celebrating. So if the prodigal streak in you shows up by looking for fulfillment in all the things that the world offers, apart from God and apart from His plan, God says to you, come home. And let me celebrate you as my daughter, my son. Find in me the party that you always wanted and the fulfillment that you always sought. And if the prodigal streak in you shows up by always trying to look good, work hard, and resenting everyone else who doesn't, God says to you, come home. And know the place I have for you as my son, my daughter. Find in me life beyond duty. I have so much more to offer you than you think. Because there's not one prodigal in the story, there's two. And to both of them, our Father in heaven would say, exchange slaving for celebrating. We have relegated the category prodigal to mean wild living, raucous and reckless, bad behavior. But it literally applies to anyone. It applies to all of us when we find ourselves living far from God and far from His heart. In the end, we are all prodigals. And our Father in heaven has one solution. He wants to free us from our slavery and celebrate us as His children. Jesus, thank you so much for explaining in a story the very heart of God, the very heart of Christianity, the very heart of our faith. Thank you for this timeless, epic story that convicts us to our toes and changes us from the inside out. May we more and more reflect the heart of the Father. May we be those who understand your desire for us and come home and live in the celebration, in the joy, in the relationship that you long to have with us. Lord, would you help us to see and recognize early in our own lives these prodigal streaks that show up in many ways, in many forms. And keep us close to your heart, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.